Hello, my name is Emma, and this is the story of the day my family taught me what I truly meant to them and the day I stopped waiting for their permission to matter. It was the last Sunday in September, and like every year, our extended family gathered in the community hall of Wesleyan Church in Little Rock for our annual fall reunion. The air smelled like pumpkin spice and cinnamon cider. Kids ran past folding chairs while paper leaves hung from twine across the ceiling. On the far wall, a hand-painted banner, read in bold orange letters, "Family, Tradition, Blessings." I arrived a little before noon. Wearing a lavender knit dress I had made myself 25 years ago. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't modern. But it was mine. I wore it to my husband's funeral, to my son's wedding shower, to the first Thanksgiving I hosted alone. Every stitch told a story. And that day, I thought just for a moment, it might still matter. But as I stepped into the hall, the noise quieted like someone had turned down the volume. Then came a whisper. And a laugh. Oh my God. My teenage granddaughter giggled. Is Grandma wearing the same purple blanket from last year? I paused at the refreshment table, the cider suddenly burning in my throat. She looks like a haunted doll from a vintage shop. Someone else said. I didn't need to look to know it was my daughter-in-law. Melissa. I could hear the smile in her voice. Laughter. Not loud. Not explosive. Just enough to sting. My grandson was already typing on his phone, his screen lighting up with emojis. Family reunion. Costume edition. He muttered. No one stopped him. No one said a word in my defense. I turned to my son, Scott, who was sipping coffee in the corner. Our eyes met. His gaze dropped within a second. Nothing. Not a chuckle to soften the blow. Not a word to lift the weight. Just that look, the one I'd seen more and more over the years, the look that said, "You don't belong anymore." The photographer clapped his hands. All right, folks. Let's gather for the group shot. Grandparents in the center. I stood there, completely still. Then I said it. Calm. Clear. Like I had practiced it in my sleep. I'll sit this one out. No one protested. No one blinked. And so I turned and walked out of the frame and out of the version of me they thought I would always be. The door clicked behind me with a softness that felt louder than anything they'd said. Outside, the Arkansas sun had dipped low enough to cast golden shadows across the parking lot. The air smelled like damp leaves and burnt sugar from the festival across the street. I didn't rush. I walked past the cornstalk decorations, past the faded wooden sign that said, "Wesleyan welcomes you," and toward my car head high. Heart heavy. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. What I felt was harder to name, like disappointment. Only deeper. Like the dull ache of a promise breaking slowly over time. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands still on the keys but didn't start the engine. My reflection stared back at me in the window. Wrinkles. Silver hair. Lavender dress. I used to be someone they ran to when they scraped a knee or had a bad dream. Now, I was a running joke. A cautionary tale about what not to wear. That night, back home, I turned on the porch light out of habit. No one was coming. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around your bones. I walked through the kitchen, fingers grazing the worn edge of the table where we used to carve pumpkins. Past the bookshelf, lined with photos, Scott in his graduation robe. My wedding picture. One baby photo still crooked from years ago. I changed out of the dress, folding it with care, and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Not because I was ashamed, but because I needed space to breathe, to think, to feel something besides invisible. Then I walked to the study. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my old filing cabinet and pulled out a faded blue folder labeled Estate and Legacy. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in years: my will, my IRA statements, the deed to the lakeside cabin, a life insurance policy I'd updated 3 winters ago naming Scott and Melissa as sole beneficiaries. I laid each one out across the table like puzzle pieces. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. I simply stared and asked myself one quiet question. If they can laugh at the person who gave them everything, why should I keep giving that night? For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the leftovers of a family gathering. I felt like a woman on the edge of a new beginning. The next morning, I brewed my coffee a little stronger than usual. The house felt different, still quiet. Still mine, but something had shifted. Like the silence had gone from empty to sacred. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand. The blue folder open before me. The morning light streamed through the lace curtains, dancing across the documents like a gentle reminder, you still have a say. And I did. For too long, I had believed legacy was something you owed to your children. Something passed down like silverware or old recipes. But now, I saw it clearer. A legacy wasn't what you left to someone. It was what you left in them. And frankly, I didn't see much of me in the way they laughed. I thought about the cabin by the lake, how I scraped together the down payment after years of teaching and summers tutoring. I remembered cleaning it top to bottom each spring. Not because anyone visited, but because I believed one day they might want to. I imagined my grandkids running barefoot down the dock, catching frogs. I pictured holidays filled with laughter, not the kind that mocked, but the kind that healed. That image had kept me going. Until it didn't. I pulled out a yellow notepad and started writing line by line what I wanted to change. I circled words like revocable and beneficiary, like a woman reclaiming more than just her assets. I was reclaiming her worth. That afternoon, I drove to the law office of Fayette and Hill, a modest brick building tucked between the post office and an old ice cream parlor in Bentonville. As I walked in, the receptionist looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" I returned the smile, calm and steady. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to speak with someone about rewriting my will." The woman behind the desk blinked, then nodded. "Do you have a lawyer in mind? Her name's Amanda Choi," I replied. "She was one of my students. Back in 2004? Smartest kid in the room." Moments later, Amanda walked into the lobby, surprised and beaming. "Mrs. Whitaker. Wow, this is a surprise." I smiled back. "Not a bad one, I hope." She laughed. "Never." And as she led me down the hall toward her office, I felt something bloom inside me, not revenge, not regret. Resolve. I wasn't here to punish anyone. I was here to make sure that when I left this world, I left behind something I believed in again. Amanda's office was warm, lined with books and framed photos of her young daughter drawing with sidewalk chalk. She poured us both a cup of chamomile tea and handed me a legal pad. "No pressure," she said kindly. "Just tell me what you're thinking." I took a breath, steady and sure. Then I began. "I want to remove all existing beneficiaries, Scott. Melissa, the grandchildren. I want everything reassigned." Amanda raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I'm not doing this out of spite," I continued. "I'm doing this because I finally see things as they are." She nodded slowly. "And what would you like to happen?" Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a typed sheet I had drafted the night before. "I want to create something new called the Hands of Grace Fund, a nonprofit that supports women over 50 who've faced abandonment, abuse, or loss. Women like me. Women who've been laughed at, Left behind. Or made to feel invisible. Amanda leaned forward. Her voice quiet but full of admiration. That's beautiful. And bold. I want the lakeside cabin to become a retreat workshop. I continued. Where they can learn sewing, quilting, embroidery practical skills. Yes, but also reclaim something that's been taken from them, their dignity. She scribbled notes quickly, asking legal, clarifying questions as we moved through the details. I told her I'd keep enough to buy a small one-bedroom cottage near the local college, where I could continue tutoring part-time. Nothing fancy. Just enough for a warm light, a working stove, and a porch to drink tea on. As Amanda typed the first draft of the revised will, I looked down at my hands resting on the desk. For years, these hands had held babies, folded laundry, wiped tears, graded papers, stitched hems, and never once asked to be seen. Now, they were signing something bold, something final, something free. At the bottom of the new will, my name appeared in black ink, Emma L. Whitaker. Next to the title Founder, Hands of Grace Fund. Amanda looked up from her laptop. You're sure? I smiled, not out of pride, but peace. Yes, I said. I'm not leaving behind money. I'm leaving behind meaning we made copies, filed signatures, and notarized everything. By the time I walked back into the autumn air, the leaves had begun to fall like silent witnesses. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was giving something up. I felt like I had taken something back. 3 days later, the phone rang just after sunset. I didn't need to check the caller ID. Mom. Scott's voice came through. Already tight. Melissa and I just got word from the bank. The cabin's deed has been transferred. Is this real? You're giving it away? I stirred my tea. Let the silence settle. Then I answered, calm as stone. Yes. It's real. I've made the decision. There was a pause. Sharp breaths. Then his voice rose. I had plans for that place. Mom, we were using it as collateral for an investment. I already had a meeting scheduled. What are you thinking? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I simply said, I'm thinking about legacy. And who deserves it? The call ended with no goodbye. That evening, they showed up at my front door. Melissa wore a tense smile, her arms folded. Scott looked like someone trying to be polite while carrying a storm. We just want to talk, Melissa said. I stepped aside. Then come in. We sat at my kitchen table where I'd once served them pot roast and homemade pies. Now it was covered in papers. The new will, the trust documents, the transfer confirmations, everything filed, everything final. Scott stared at them like they might catch fire. You can't do this. We're your family. I nodded slowly. And yet, at that church hall, not one of you stood up for me. He opened his mouth, but I raised my hand. I'm not angry. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm offering clarity. Melissa's voice cracked. So what? We just get nothing. You have everything you need. I said, you have your house, your careers, your family. Scott leaned forward, frustration bleeding into desperation. You're punishing us over a joke, no? I replied, I'm responding to a pattern. Years of being dismissed, talked over, ignored. That photo shoot wasn't the first time. It was just the moment I finally heard it loud enough. I reached for a photo in the folder one Scott had once shared in a family group text. Captioned, Grandma. Cosplay level unlocked. I placed it in the center of the table. That's the face you laughed at. Scott looked away. Melissa stayed silent. I stood, gathering the folder into my arms. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm just asking you to accept it. As they left, Scott turned at the door. You've destroyed our future. I met his eyes one last time. No. I just stopped pretending that disrespect deserves inheritance. 2 weeks later, I packed up the last of my belongings into the back of a borrowed pickup truck and turned the key to my old house for the final time. The road to Bentonville curved through stretches of pine and maple, their leaves blushing gold and crimson. When I arrived at the cabin by the lake, it didn't feel like I was downsizing. It felt like I was returning to something that had always waited quietly for me to choose it. The cabin's white siding was weathered but strong. I painted the porch trim sage green and planted lavender along the walkway. Inside, I cleared out old furniture and turned the main room into an open, sunlit space. Above the mantel, I hung a hand-painted wooden sign that read Hands of Grace Workshop, and next to it, on a small iron hook, I carefully placed the lavender knit dress. The same one they laughed at. Not hidden, not boxed away, but framed like a relic not of shame, but of survival. By the spring equinox, 6 women had signed up for our first sewing circle. They came with calloused hands, tired eyes, and soft voices that hesitated to tell their stories. Some had been left by husbands. Others were widows or empty nesters. One, Eleanor, had been living in her car for 6 months after escaping a violent home. I welcomed each of them by name, offered tea, lemon bars, a place to sit without judgment. This isn't about perfect stitches, I told them. It's about patching what the world tried to tear. Some hadn't threaded a needle in decades. Others were experts. But within that room, there were no beginners or masters, only women reclaiming the rhythm of their hands and, slowly, their dignity. We met every Thursday and Saturday. We stitched quilts and stories. We sewed with mismatched fabric, just like our mismatched histories. And in the middle of it all stood that old purple dress, quiet, watching, honored. One evening, after class, Sandra, the most reserved of the group, lingered behind. She placed her hand on the hem of the dress and whispered, I used to be embarrassed by my clothes. But now, I see this. And I feel proud. You made something from pain. That gives me hope. I didn't answer right away. I just smiled, placed my hand over hers, and said softly, that's exactly why it's here. In that moment, I knew they hadn't just mocked a dress. They had underestimated a woman who still had more to give than they could imagine. The letters started arriving in early May. At first, they came once a week, then twice, then a small bundle every other day tied in twine, slipped under the door, or dropped in the old rusted mailbox by the gate. They were handwritten, folded with care, and every single one carried something more powerful than any apology I'd ever hoped for. They carried truth. The first was from Eleanor, the woman who once lived in her car. She had stitched a soft, sea blue baby blanket in our workshop, her first creation in over a decade. Her note read, Dear Emma, I used to think I was useless, that no one would ever look at something I made and smile. But last week, a young mother picked my blanket from the raffle table and cried. She said it reminded her of home. You gave me back a purpose I forgot I had. Thank you for seeing me when I didn't even see myself. I read that one 3 times before tucking it in a small wooden box I labeled Threads of Impact. Another came from Linda, a former factory seamstress who used to work the night shift in Tulsa. Dear Emma, I never thought retirement would feel like erasure. But in your circle, I became a teacher again. I watched women copy my stitches. I laughed without fear of being invisible. You didn't just create a space, you created a ripple. And now, I matter again. I cried when I read that one. Not loudly. Not broken. Just a quiet stream. Like a needle pulling thread through fabric worn thin. Each letter reminded me that I hadn't just changed where my legacy went, I had changed what it meant. These weren't thank you notes. They were testaments. To survival. To sisterhood. To second chances. And every time I walked into the workshop and saw the purple dress hanging beneath the Hands of Grace sign, I no longer felt sorrow for the room I walked out of that day. Because now, I was walking into rooms that needed me. Rooms where laughter didn't sting, where silence wasn't punishment, but peace. One afternoon, after reading a letter from a woman in Michigan who'd started a similar circle in her garage, I whispered to the empty cabin. This is what inheritance looks like when it's built with your hands, not your bloodline. And I smiled, knowing I had not just sewn a dress. I had sewn a movement. By early summer, the town had started to take notice. The whispers of what we were doing at the Hands of Grace cabin had found their way into farmers' markets, church bulletins, and PTA meetings. It wasn't just the quilts or the sewing. It was the energy, the healing, the quiet joy that came from a room full of women, rediscovering themselves one stitch at a time. Then, one day, a young reporter named Chelsea from the Bentonville Chronicle called. I'd love to come by, she said. Just to observe. Maybe take a few photos. We've been hearing a lot about what you're building out there. He hesitated. Part of me still remembered what it felt like to be mocked in a photo framed in judgment instead of celebration. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew this was something worth showing the world. So, I said yes. Chelsea arrived with a camera and a notebook. But new assumptions. She watched as Betty demonstrated how to turn old flannel shirts into quilt squares. She listened as Sandra, shy as ever, read a poem she'd written and embroidered on muslin. She sat next to me while we shared cinnamon tea and talked about dignity not as a concept, but as a daily practice. A week later, the article came out. Front page of the Sunday edition, Threads of Grace. How one Arkansas woman is restitching purpose after pain. There was a photo of the workshop's sunlight pouring through the cabin windows. Hands busy with thread. The purple dress hanging like a sentinel on the back wall. The article told the truth. About the laughter I walked away from. About the mission I chose instead. About how legacy can be redirected not out of revenge, but out of recognition. Later that week, I got a letter from a woman in Tennessee. She'd clipped the article and mailed it with a simple note. My granddaughter read this and said, "Grandma, this looks like something you'd love." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like an example. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just changed my story. I had opened a door for others to rewrite theirs. And the dress they laughed at. It was now on the front page of a newspaper that made strangers feel proud. It was a Tuesday morning in late July, when Jenna showed up with a basket of sunflowers and a quiet question in her eyes. Jenna was one of our youngest volunteers, 22. Soft-spoken. Always tying her apron twice for good luck. She'd been with us since spring. Learning embroidery. Helping serve tea. And sitting with the older women like she'd known them her whole life. That morning, I was out on the porch sipping my tea, watching the lake catch the light. When Jenna stepped up to the railing, "Mrs. Whitaker," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" I set my cup down and smiled. Always. She looked toward the open cabin door, where the purple dress still hung. just above the mantel. Why do you keep it there after everything? Why not just pack it away? I followed her gaze. The dress looked softer now in the morning sun. Like time itself had forgiven it. Or maybe, like I had. That's a good question, I said. There was a time I thought about hiding it. After all, it was the punchline in someone else's joke. But the truth is, the dress never changed. What changed was how they chose to see it. Jenna stayed quiet, listening. I made that dress during one of the hardest chapters of my life. I wore it to my husband's funeral. I wore it when I signed the papers to refinance the house after he passed. And I wore it the day I was told, with laughter, that I looked like a joke. I paused, steadying my breath. But that dress isn't a joke. It's a declaration. It says I survived. I showed up. I loved deeply. I gave everything I had. Jenna's eyes shimmered. It's beautiful, she whispered. It always was, I said. They just couldn't see it. She reached into her basket and pulled out a single sunflower, placing it in a mason jar beside me. Then, with a small nod, she walked toward the cabin where the women were already gathered, ready to stitch, ready to share, ready to continue the work. As she stepped inside, I looked once more at the dress. Not with sorrow, not with shame, but with reverence. Because the girl who asked the question and the dress that carried the answer both reminded me, legacy isn't about what's new. It's about what lasts. The sun was just rising when I brewed my morning tea that September day, the same time of year it had all started. The lavender along the walkway was in full bloom. The basil had grown wild around the porch steps. Inside the workshop, the air still smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon thread oil. I sat on the porch with a worn journal in my lap, reflecting on everything this place had become. Across the yard, the cabin door stood open. Through the screen, I could see the hum of women already gathering, Grace setting up fabric rolls, Betty pouring tea, and Jenna hanging up a new embroidery piece that read in soft cursive, "Dignity is something you stitch, not something you're handed." I smiled. Over the past months, the Hands of Grace workshop had grown into more than a space. It had become a sanctuary, a rhythm, a place where women who'd been overlooked came to be seen, not as burdens, but as builders. Some brought pain, others brought silence, but all of them left with something stitched back together. And hanging on the back wall, just as it always had, was the lavender knit dress. No longer mocked, no longer misunderstood. Now it was part of the room, part of the story, a quiet witness to every hand that trembled at first, then learned to trust again. That afternoon, I wrote a letter to a woman in Oregon who'd reached out asking for guidance to start a similar workshop in her rural town. I told her this: start with a single chair, a single kettle of tea. Hang something on the wall that reminds you who you are, not who they said you were. The rest will come. Before bed that night, I walked into the workshop one last time. The light from the porch lanterns spilled across the wood floors, catching the threads of fabric that had fallen loose throughout the day. I didn't sweep them up. They were beautiful as they were imperfect, unfinished, real. I stood in front of the dress and placed my hand gently over the knit fabric. I whispered, "You were never just a dress. You were a beginning." And with that, I turned out the lights. Not because anything had ended, but because what we had created would shine long after we were gone.